Welcome back to Connect Canyons. I'm Stephanie Christensen, and we're here again with Gretchen Zaitsev, District Library Specialist. We are doing our monthly book chat, and we are covering a very interesting book today, one that Gretchen has recommended to us. So I'm going to pass over to you right now, Gretchen, so that you can introduce our special guest.
It is my pleasure to introduce Tiffany Rosenhan. Tiffany has a degree in political science. She often travels the world with her 4 young daughters and her husband, who is a critical care physician. Fortunately for us, she lives here locally in Utah, and we had the pleasure of reading her debut novel, Girl from Nowhere. Tiffany, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
This is so exciting. How did you come about writing a book?
I have to say I fell into it. I started writing stories when my first daughter was born about 15 years ago, and I'd gone through college pretty quickly, and I found myself home with this new baby, and I loved being home, but my mind was kind of bored. And so I started writing stories as a way to entertain myself, and I just wrote stories for fun for years until I finally realized that I had something that I just couldn't walk away from. And at that point, really, I had found creative writing, or rather creative writing had found me, and I've never looked back. So I'm an accidental writer, you could say, but now it's a huge part of my life, and I couldn't feel more grateful for the opportunity I have to write stories.
That is awesome. Now, Gretchen, you recommended this book, and as a school library specialist, what is it about this book that really stood out to you?
The thing I love about The Girl from Nowhere is it's so accessible for any kind of reader. So it doesn't matter if you're the once a year pick up a book reader, or if you're, inhaling books for breakfast. This is a book that you would enjoy, and it doesn't matter if you're like male or female, if you're old or young. I just found it totally accessible. When I picked it up, I think I finished it in 2 sittings, but only because I had to stop to eat.
Well, thank you. That's the biggest compliment you can give me, is that you finished it quickly.
Now, Tiffany, can you give us a just quick synopsis of how you would describe this book?
This book is really just a James Bond movie with a teenage female protagonist. I'm really not there to teach to you or preach to you. I just want to entertain you. I liked stories that kept me up late reading, that entertained me, that gave me a good escape. I had kind of a chaotic childhood, and reading was my escape, so I want to offer that in return. So I just wanted to have it be a fun story, like a Mission Impossible movie with a 15-year-old girl as the main character.
It definitely read as a movie to me, and I read in the back of your book of how your great-grandma actually has won an Academy Award, and I was like, oh, the film geek in me was freaking out. But it totally read.
There's a little dramatic in me, I guess you could say.
Well, it read as though I could see the characters. I could see who I could cast. I really felt like this could be a great TV series even. I was kind of wondering, where's it going to go next?
Well, it's all good news in that direction, but I can't share much. But it is moving forward with filming, so we'll see. We'll see where things go.
We are on the cutting edge, Canyons. Hold on for updates to come.
I will give updates when I can. So yeah, it's. I do prefer, when you write a story that's a young adult spy thriller, you kind of have to make a decision. Is this cartoonish or is this real? And I wanted it to feel real and, like you said, accessible, but it's kind of a compromise. So I chose a character that was fun and playful, and yet she exists in this real world. And the way I see my character, she's a spy, and she, showcases these stunts and tricks and these extreme skill sets. But really, to me, she just mirrors the really incredibly hard things the teenage girls I know are doing. And so while she's in this hyper reality, to me what's real and authentic about the story is that she represents real teenage girls doing hard things. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons it resonates with people.
I think the part that resonated the most with me within that is the way that you wrote her anxiety, her past traumas, and the trying to work through just those overwhelming feelings of anxiety because of the horrible things that have happened as a spy, but also just as being a new student in a school and having to try, to fit into middle America, which I think every one of us can relate to feeling like the odd one out. Yes. And you did such a great job of doing that with an exceptional person. It was kind of a cool, because generally when you do a young adult book where the person doesn't fit in, it's usually like, oh, well, she's adorkable, or she's like kind of the nerdy girl that, but this is a truly exceptional person. It was a cool take on that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that compliment.
That also spoke to me, being that new person, while trying to fit in and feel secure and having that nagging feeling in the back that either you are not measuring up or you are not secure, but finding friends along the way who were helping you. And that's what I loved about her friends in Wyoming, were that they were that support group for her. There was not the cattiness that is so stereotypical in a lot of YA novels. These were people you would generally meet and could really see her like connecting to, and that they were open to kind of these flashes. I don't know if it was brilliance or, I mean, the scene where she backs the car out after the Halloween dance, I was like, yeah, girl.
No driver's license needed.
Well, I love that you said that, because I moved around a lot as a kid. I was in new schools frequently, and so I empathize with her, and yet I also have to clarify and say I'm a little exempt from those feelings because I'm an identical twin. And so I had the benefit and the privilege of moving a lot and meeting new friends and settling in new schools, but I had the security of having my best friend with me. And so I had this odd dichotomy where I experienced it, but in maybe a safer, healthier way. And so I recognize and I acknowledge those feelings, of feeling like you don't fit in and you don't belong, and yet they didn't traumatize me the way they might others, because I had my twin sister. So I feel like I had the benefit of that without the kind of trauma that can be associated with that. And I think that's where Sophia comes from in a lot of ways. It's just my vulnerability as a teen and wanting to feel like you fit in, and yet I unintentionally really, there were no mean girls in the book, and I've never written mean girls into the book. And someone pointed that out, and it kind of struck me by surprise that I had never even thought about it, because that was never my experience. The girls I associated with were kind and welcoming and inclusive. And yes, there's issues, but I feel like it's too easy to categorize girls as just being,
Threatened.
Yes.
By the new girl.
By the new girl.
And especially when you're moving into like a small town where people may have gone to school with each other for a long time. And one of the things I also liked was I felt like the teenagers were very authentic. And I liked that Sophia and Alex were equally yoked. I do that all the time.
Everyone does. It's okay. Yeah, they were pretty equal, weren't they?
Well, they were equally yoked in that, they had similarities that were became more apparent over the course of the novel, which made it seem like, oh yeah, that would be a reason why they might be attracted to each other.
I love that. That's well said.
One of the things that I was very curious about with it is a lot of times in young adult novels or any female-led novel, I always find that they introduce the woman based on her looks. It's always kind of, she was either not the most attractive woman or she was incredibly attractive. And one of the things I loved about Sophia, you introduced her by her accomplishments. Like, it stuck out to me more that she speaks 14 languages. She speaks this. If you asked me what she looked like, I didn't focus on that like I do in other books, which I thought I really enjoyed that. I think you really navigated staying away from stereotypes that are so detrimental to girls. And I really think you built up a really strong female character. Was that part of the reason that you chose?
I have to say, so much of Girl from Nowhere evolved just naturally and subconsciously. There wasn't a lot of intention, but I feel like it's a natural byproduct of what I believe. I mean, I'm a mother of 4 daughters, and growing up reading all the spy thrillers, I love them, and yet it is hard to be taken seriously as a spy thriller author as a female, because most of them are penned by men. And I think most spy thriller authors tend to sexualize women, and they tend to have the women even if they're incredibly capable and talented, they tend to solve problems by their appearance and their physical bodies. And I wanted to intentionally do something different with my character, because I wanted her to solve problems with her intellect and her skills that she's trained for. And that doesn't mean she can't also be beautiful and lovely and talented and kind and good. But she also has skills and talents that she can use and is equipped with in order to, defeat the enemy. But I didn't want to follow the tradition of spy thrillers where they just sexualize the female character.
And that's something that I would think that, because I'm a parent of a daughter, she's only 9, so I don't know that I'm going to have her read it yet, but I thought about this book immediately afterwards, that I did want my son to read it and my daughter eventually, because first of all, it's a fun read, and anytime you can get your kid reading is a win. But secondly, I really did enjoy that it didn't go to the stereotypes of even the popular kids. It's so easy to do that, us and them within the high school, and there was none of that, and I truly enjoyed that.
Well, thank you. I feel fortunate. I must have gone to a good high school that taught me well because I had good friends and I had people that were kind, that were very different from me, and yet we got along pretty well. And so I think that's also an environment that people can be in without being stereotypically boxed into these high school social groups. That wasn't as realistic for me, so I didn't write about it.
One of the things I also thought was authentic was, in spite of the fact that she has all this training and all these talents and all this experience, that she still sometimes makes decisions where, like any teenager, where their brain is not all connected and there are consequences which are natural, but it helps move the story along. Especially, like, she goes out and she runs and it's about to snow, and I'm like, I could totally see a person in the place where she was in the story making that decision, in spite of the fact that the rest of us are going, that's not smart. You're so
Maybe
dumb.
a treadmill.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think she's always been, to me, just an average girl with a complicated life. She has these skills not because she's a robot or because she's an alien, but because her parents have trained her in a very specific way. And she's like my 15-year-old daughter. I mean, I'll take my 15-year-old daughter to tennis practice, and she doesn't have a tennis bag. And I'm like, how do you get in the car and go to practice without your equipment? And it doesn't even cross her mind because she's 15, and 15-year-old brains are undeveloped. So I hope she makes mistakes. I definitely don't want her to be perfect, nor did I ever want this character to be perfect. I want her to be cool and fun to read about, but really I just want her to be a girl that's struggling with her own hormones and emotions and feelings while dealing with some, kind of fun, hyper-realistic, events.
Well, she deals with these, like, crazy things like international spy rings and the math test. Yes. So, I feel like, I was like, I want to live that life, where I have these big, lofty things that are impacting my life, but I still have this reality that I live in like everybody else.
But don't we all deal with things that are incredibly important, and it's a counterbalance to the nitty-gritty of our daily life? I feel like that's realistic. We all have these things that are incredibly valuable to us, and we have to struggle through and work through, and it's not as fun as like the spy thriller side, but we're nonetheless all kind of persevering and pushing through, and it's challenging, and so I think we have to rely on our skill sets. So we are kind of like all spies, I guess, in a way.
What drew you to the YA genre, if you would call it a genre?
I've always read YA. I loved YA. I feel like there's something kind of really beautiful and primitive about a young student's experience, teenager or youth. I feel like we only view the world the way we do as a teenager when we're teenagers, and we forget the rest of our lives. And I feel like there's this raw lens that teenagers view the world that's real and authentic. You can't really trick them. You can't beat around the bush. They have this instinct that they see through you. And I think that's incredibly valuable and something that we tend to criticize about youth, but I think it's an asset. And so I've just loved the way that teenagers view life, and I want to be in that. And I guess I want to stay young by reminding myself how I viewed the world when I was the optimism and the fearlessness. I think that's valuable, and so I just love YA. I think you can do things in YA that you can't do as adults. We're more forgiving of the bad choices when they're 15 than we are if she's 25. Then it's just obnoxious, right? But when teenagers are developing, we give them more grace. We allow them to make mistakes. We allow them to question authority and understand themselves. So I think it's a really pivotal time in life, and so I just kind of want to be in there longer, I guess. I think when I think of Girl from Nowhere and who the audience is, one of the people I think about are just women, because I think we're all teen girls at heart, and that's something that I never want to lose.
I always find when I read YA, it's kind of cathartic too,
Yeah.
because it's like, I feel that anxiety and the insecurities that I felt as a teenager, but I feel it from an adult perspective where I can go, this too shall pass.
Well said.
Which is such a great
Yeah.
thing within life when you get the perspective of time.
You do.
One of the things I like about this is I can read it with my daughter, and so then we can talk about it, which is something we love to do. And we're always sharing back and forth books that we like and telling each other, you got to read this next. But I also love the fact that Sophia has two parents. Mm-hmm. So often the parents disappear from the story so that this protagonist can have adventures. And I love that the parents are right there beside her the whole story, providing support in the way that they can, and yet you know in your heart that she's capable of saving herself.
I love that. Yeah, the parents are really intrinsically involved in this story. Also, they're part of the plot in a way, and so maybe that's too my own. I didn't have my parents live together, so maybe I projected a little bit of what it would be like if you were an only child with both parents. Like, what would that be like? How much attention would you get?
Yeah, and you can tell she spent a lot of time with her parents because she always goes back to the things I learned from my parents, which is, something for me. I mean, I hope that I've instilled a love for reading in my children, and I see in them developing into writers, which is not something I have done myself. But, certainly reading was something we did as a family, and we always talked about books. And I think you had a similar experience with reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself, yes, I'm an author, but I'm a reader first. And I was really fortunate to grow up with parents that both loved to read and valued reading and valued the time we spent reading. And I've hopefully encouraged my girls to read. And we know some people have movie nights, and we do that also. But I treat nights on the couch when we're all reading together as an event as well. And that's important and valuable to me. Even if we're all in different books, we're in the room together. And treating reading as something that's a valuable use of their time has been important to me, and I hope I continue to raise readers. But I certainly owe a debt of gratitude for my parents for allowing me to read everything and anything I wanted. They let me explore all types of fiction, all types of genres. I was reading weird encyclopedias about military warfare in 1942, and I was probably 9, and my mom, another parent, might be like, "That's weird, don't read that," but I loved reading about tactics and technical warfare, and that was interesting to me, and my parents let me read it. And I value that they did that because it allowed me to explore and broaden my imagination, which led me to writing a story like this.
Well, I was going to say we all benefited from that experience because you can definitely see the research that was involved in this book. And when I was reading it, I was like, has she been to these places?
I was thinking the exact same thing. I was like, how do you know? Did you Google Earth it?
I have been fortunate to travel quite a bit. I have not been to all the places that she visited. 2 places in particular I have not been, which I think is kind of interesting because I have traveled quite a bit, but I haven't been to Istanbul or Tunis, which are 2 cities that Sophia is in during the book. I don't want to give anything away. And I think it's kind of funny that I defaulted to some places I hadn't been, despite having been so many other places. And I think part of the reason is there's this romanticism attached to places we haven't yet seen, and I kind of want to embrace that sometimes. I want it to feel real and authentic, and yet I kind of want to live in this romantic idea of what a location might feel like, look like, smell like. That's fun as a writer to create. Sometimes once you go somewhere, you feel a little more constrained, but there's also a magic that happens when you're exploring and imagining what a place might be. So there's a combination in the book of places I've been, places I haven't, but it doesn't really matter where you go or where I've been. I feel like when I research a place or location for the book and for the second book, I really focus on the details that make that location unique and specific. So rather than the old cathedral that everyone visits if it's in Europe, it's what do they eat for breakfast? How do the children get to school? So if Sophia's outside at 8 a.m., are the kids in taxis? Are they walking by themselves? Or like in Paris, all the little kids ride scooters, like razor scooters to school. And you take these little details and absorb them to make the location feel real and authentic. So I definitely applied myself to research, but I can't say it wasn't fun because it was super fun. So I love researching locations.
I'm curious about your method. When you went into writing this story, it kind of came about organically that you started writing. Did you come up with an outline where you knew, okay, I have this girl, I want to have this and this and this happen with this result? Or did you just kind of let things flow onto the page and see where it went?
So I have to say my methods evolved over time to be more efficient. When I wrote Girl From Nowhere, I wrote the whole kind of series out. I had so much fun writing it and researching it and developing the story. And once I had this girl's whole life, I basically had to identify what were the plots. At that point, I did do more outlining and structure. But with this and the other few books that I have kind of on the back burner, I just wrote for fun. And I feel as though I do that, like 90% of the word count comes for fun. And then at that point is when I really outline and understand what's happening, what the plot and the structure is. And then unfortunately, because my method's probably very poor, I have to go back and rewrite most of it. But I feel as though I have to create the characters naturally by writing about it in any situation they might be in. I have a lot of deleted scenes. People build and create differently. I tend to write a scene about, let's say there's a birthday party, and I write the whole birthday party. And those 10 pages are not in the book, but in my mind they happened, and they built this character's this characteristic of this character or this idea. And so I tend to overwrite and then cut everything out and rewrite what's the plot, because I want things to move quickly, which means I don't have a lot of room. So when you want a thriller, you've got to move the pace and you got to move the pages. So I tend to write a lot, figure out what works, rewrite what works, and discard the rest.
I recently heard an interview with Taika Waititi, the director of Thor and other things, and he said that his writing process is kind of an interesting one in that he will write the story out, leave it for a few years, and not reread it and rewrite it, so that he knows what the important parts were from his memory, so that he can single out what the things that needed to stick out for everybody else. So it's kind of interesting.
It's
that
actually,
you said,
that's pretty similar to what I do with a bunch of stories, because I work on things simultaneously. I do really well working on multiple projects at once because we're in different moods. Sometimes I want to be heavy in research. Sometimes I want to be heavy creating this romance scene, and it's fun to write about. And I'm like, oh, and then I question. I don't even know who these characters are. Like, what are they doing? So it's a combination. But I do think time away from your manuscript is incredibly valuable. The ones I've circled back to, I had a little bit of a break after signing with Bloomsbury and publishing Girl from Nowhere, and now because of some health crises in my family. So I'm now circling back to a lot of material that I had I was pretty heavily involved in. And it's interesting that you mentioned that method, because I've looked back at this material and it's been very clear to me what's relevant and what's irrelevant. So time away is a great filtering system. You tend to not want to touch the things that you know don't matter for your story, and really dive in and prioritize the components that are relevant to what you're trying to build.
So if you had people that are listening currently, or when you come, because you've been so generous to come and speak to different schools.
I've had so much fun.
What is your advice to people who would like to be authors? That, like, as students, if a student already knows, hey, this is something, because I find a lot of times in the career paths that aren't the stereotypical ones, the more creative ones that seem pie in the sky, it's really easy for kids to get frustrated and think and discouraged and think, well, no, I have to. As somebody, I got a degree in film, so I can't tell you how many times I heard, what are you going to do after you graduate with that one?
Well, now I know why you're listening to his interview.
Yeah.
So I think I had maybe 3 pieces of advice. First is to read every single day and read things that inspire you, that are interesting to you. Read, and I encourage you to write for 5 minutes a day with a pen and paper, and I encourage you to write badly and terribly. And the reason is I feel like that's how we learn, is via mistakes. And when we think too hard, we tend not to teach ourselves how to write. So I encourage you to write just every single day for 5 minutes. It doesn't matter if they're complete sentences, if it's nonsense, if you're writing in like some mishmash of English and Spanish, it doesn't matter. Just write. Because what I believe is we're all creative and we have stories, and yet what we don't all have, myself included, maybe some people are fortunate and blessed with this, but we don't have the highway between our thoughts and our imagination and our ability to write them down. And it's up to us, when we want to become writers and effective writers, that we build that highway, and we do that by practice. And so when I look at writing, people think of writing as, oh, you're just writing a book, because we're all literate. We think we could write a book, and anyone could. But if I look at, for example, my husband, who's a critical care physician, he did 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, 3 years of fellowship to have that expertise required to take care of patients in the ICU. I think being a writer is just as difficult. And the reason I say that is we can't lower our expectations of what it takes and the practice required to learn the skills required to become a writer. So rather than be discouraged, I want kids to feel empowered and say, I shouldn't feel like I can write a story right now. All I'm doing now is developing this training and this experience to where in 15 years from now, maybe less, but in 15 years from now, I've reached a point where I have the experience required to write and tackle a novel. It doesn't just come by writing a few pages a day, a few days in a row. That's the same as saying I should be able to perform surgery because I watched Grey's Anatomy. It doesn't work like that. Writing is challenging and hard, and it's a profession that requires experience and technique just like any other profession. And so, not to compare it to being a doctor, but in a way it's no different. You have to train, and you have to practice, and you have to rehearse this, and you have to have repetition. And you have to continue to study, and you study by reading. So reading is the best tool writers have to learn how to write. It always has been, and it always will be. But in a way, not to be discouraged, but to feel motivated that writing is just something we have to train to do, and anyone can become a writer. It just takes application and practice. Just like anyone can become a doctor, they just have to apply themselves and study and train. And when you think about writing as a profession that requires a high level of skill set, you begin to take it a little more seriously and give yourself more leniency and grace. Like, I shouldn't know how to write yet. I'm only 5 years into it. I shouldn't know how to write yet. I'm only 10 years into writing. I'm still learning. and that's normal and okay. Some people might disagree, but that's my opinion.
What I think is interesting about all of us is this is not our first career, and this is not the path we thought we were on when we were teenagers. We all had different paths. This is my third career. You were in film. You didn't start out as a writer, but we all came to a place, a happy place where we are now, and who knows what we're going to do in the future. And I think for students, they think, I'm going to be this when I grow up, and I can only be this. And what I try to do when I talk about authors and introducing books to students is say, this author used to be an NFL football star, and he writes books. This author was a gold medalist in figure skating, and she writes books. And so that the idea is that the reading and writing that you can do every day can happen over a long period of time while you're doing something else. And you then get to some point where you feel really comfortable, expressing yourself in written language. It doesn't have, and even if you want to be an author, like you said, the experiences of traveling and all the other life experiences have, informed your characters and built their story. But you didn't start out thinking, oh, I want to be an author, so I'm going to travel the world.
No, it's funny. I thought I would join the CAA. I'd be terrible at that. But my interest in global affairs and diplomacy and tradecraft and spycraft, led me to writing a story about that. And I think the other advice I would give to students and young writers and any adult writers is the magic in creative writing happens at this intersection between who we are and what we are uniquely curious about. That's what creative writing to me is and should be rooted in that point, because that represents a story that only we can tell. And when you focus your story and your attention on that convergence point between who you are and what you are uniquely curious about, you'll have success. And more importantly, it will be fun to write, and it'll be enjoyable because it's interesting to you.
I also think, too, that everybody has a story to tell. And so they have to figure out how to tell that story, and either they can tell it on the page, they can be a storyteller, they can be a filmmaker, but they have a story to tell that is, like you said, uniquely theirs. And that. So they have to find some creative outlet on the way to being a doctor or being an astronaut or whatever else it is that they want to be. That urge, that need to tell stories is within us all. And so, telling those stories is really part of, maybe why we're here on the planet.
Yeah, I love that. I couldn't agree more. I think that's valuable, and I think each of us has a story to tell, and if we don't tell it, who will? And I also think I started writing stories because I'd been very bad at journals and diaries, and yet I found that by writing stories about others, I was better able to understand myself and process the world around me and process my own emotions. And so while I'm an author professionally, it's my job, creative writing remains something I do for myself. And I encourage others to embrace writing as something they do for themselves. Whether or not they want to become a professional writer, to me, is kind of irrelevant, because creative writing that I do each day is something that I do that's for me. And I happen to get stories out of it for work, but most of what I write is just for me. And that's valuable as well. So.
Absolutely.
Well, as a school librarian, we appreciate authors who are as generous as yourself, who spend time helping students understand the process and answering their questions and writing books that they can read. So thank you for putting your story to paper for us and for the time that you've spent in our schools. What about school visits is a real positive for you?
I think it's all positive. It's really rewarding for me to meet other writers. I'm so impressed by these young writers. Like I said, I did not know I always wanted to be an author. So when these 11, 12, 13-year-olds are have notebooks and lists and stories, I'm so impressed because that wasn't me. And I want to just share with them what I've learned and also motivate them that they can do this. The only thing that stands between them and a finished product is application. So learning to apply themselves is the only limit and barrier to becoming a writer. So I definitely enjoy it. I've developed such an admiration for librarians and what the role they play in our communities. I grew up with parents that love to read, as I mentioned, and so I came late to really understanding the role librarians played because I was already a reader. I already had so many books at home. And yet what I've witnessed the last year speaking at schools has been really transformative in my understanding of what librarian services do for our communities, because so many kids don't have access at home. And if they do have access, it might be limited. And so librarians have played this essential role in advocating for literacy and for writing, but advocating for literacy among our youth in our community. And so it's important to me just to supplement in what way I can by supporting them and motivating students and young writers to keep reading and keep writing, not just because they want to become writers, but because both reading and writing represent valuable ways that they learn to understand themselves and will eventually contribute back to our community. So I've been really impressed by the work that's being done in in libraries and among schools right now, especially post-COVID. It's been a little, hard for everyone, and it's nice to see that books are still accessible for students in a way that they were accessible to me, where it was escapism. And I think maybe that's why I like to write books that are escapist, but I always appreciated those authors who wrote these fun stories that allowed me to escape the chaos of my life. And so if I can in some way contribute by speaking to schools and speaking to students about writing, it's important to me to do so. I also feel like what I offer in this book in particular is an adventure and an escape. And if I can add to that experience in some way by answering questions and talking to them about how I built the book, what inspired it, what kind of stories were written, it's part of what I feel like I owe the reader, because I promised them an experience. And if I can add to that experience by sharing more, I want to do that. Students are impressive. They get a hard rap right now because we've all gone through so much, and kids especially have suffered, I think, during COVID more than anyone. And so they need to be invigorated again. And I think we can all contribute to that by and I admire how much they've worked through, and I admire their commitment to writing at such a young age. I am in awe of how committed they are and what the creative writing classes that are available. I certainly never took a creative writing class, and yet these kids are incredibly competent and efficient writers. And so I want to guide them in whatever way I can, small way I can.
So I am a reader who reads from the very first word on the flap all the way to the last word on the back flap. Okay. And so one of the things I loved after reading Sophia's whole adventure was to then read your acknowledgments at the end. Okay. And I felt like it was really empowering in the way that you talked about females particularly, and also you called it your real women who inspired your fictional female warriors. Yeah. So you had to have had people in your life who not only encouraged you then, but now who helped with this creation. Yes. I would encourage everyone to get the book and read the whole book and then read the acknowledgments.
I agree.
Thank you. I've had a lot of messages about the acknowledgments, and I wrote it, I think, at a pretty tender time. My husband had just had a stroke. I was sending my final work in for Girl from Nowhere. And I just felt like, gosh, this book is just for girls to feel, and youth to feel better about themselves and embrace our talents, embrace what makes us strong, and not be ashamed of what makes us unique and powerful. And so I've been fortunate to have women in my life who are incredibly talented and skilled and hardworking. And of course, my mother is one of them. My great grandma was a movie star, Mary Astor, and she gets a lot of rap for her, what would you call it, her love life. She's notorious. And yet she did things that other women had never done. She stood up to the film executives in Hollywood when they told her that if she didn't back out of a custody trial and over that she was fighting for her daughter, and if she didn't withdraw from the custody trial, she would never work again. And she said, fine. And she did not withdraw, and she won the custody case and then won an Oscar for acting a few years later. And she's incredibly brave. And so I feel like I've had those women in my life, those stories. It's part of me. And then I also have friends who've been fortunate to join the world of intelligence and have kindly kind of offered support and guidance with the manuscript. So I can't obviously disclose any of that, but I'm really fortunate that I have some pretty smart women who are willing to listen to me and answer my questions. And they're pretty impressive. They've fought hard for our country and for young girls and women in very remote regions of the world, and their stories are incredible. So they work really hard every day to create opportunities for young women throughout the world, and I admire what they do. And so they were generous with their time, helping me make sure the story works. So women are incredible.
They are, and I think what you have done is also incredibly brave. I think it takes a lot to put your creative baby out there into the world and to go to a publishing house to do so, because currently in the publishing world, if I understand correctly, I could be completely off my rocker. It seems like a lot of people are going the online publishing route where they do it themselves because it's a little bit easier. Yeah. But I think it's incredibly brave to turn in a manuscript and to say, you know what, this is worthwhile. And I'm grateful that you did. Well, how did you go about that, though, for someone who wants to become published?
So I hate to speak on behalf of publishing because things are changing constantly and everyone's experience is different. But I knew with my style of story, young adult fiction, it's not in a specific genre. It's really just like Gretchen said in the beginning, it's accessible, and the benefit of it is it's really great for boy readers, girl readers, adult readers, women. I have these cute old men at the tennis club where my daughter plays tennis, and they told me they read the book and they liked it, and I was so flattered. And I'm like, that's so fun. It's just a fun story. They said it was like the Da Vinci Code, but with a teen girl. Like, I just like flipping those pages. And I'm like, thank you. And I never expected them to read it. But without having a really unique genre to fit into, I think it's a good thing, but it's also a very hard thing when it comes to marketing and publicity because you don't have an audience that's established that's looking for your type of story, whether you're social justice or fantasy or dystopian. I don't fit into any of those genres easily. I barely fit into thriller because it's really a spy thriller, and there's just not a lot of spy thrillers in young adult fiction. Certainly not a lot of ones like mine that are more James Bond and Jason Bourne than like Spy Kids. And so I think knowing in advance how complicated that market was, I knew the only way my book would be read, at least in schools or that would have reached the audience, was to go with a mainstream publisher. I think self-publishing and ebooks are fantastic for a certain type of audience. I just never felt like it was the right audience, nor did I feel like I was competent enough to produce the book in the quality that was required to make it successful. I feel as though the editorial input my editor, Claire Stetzer at Bloomsbury, gave was invaluable. She was incredibly gifted, and her ability to see the bigger picture and just make these small tweaks and changes that transformed the narrative was incredibly impressive to me. And that had all the value in the world because that made the story something from a story that I was kind of embarrassed to share with anyone to something that was like, you know what, this is the best we could do. And I'm proud of it. And it's not perfect. And there's a few things here and there I might change. But overall, I feel like working with the editorial staff at Bloomsbury, which is a compromise to go through the traditional publishing route. You have a little less control. It's a little longer. There's more people making decisions. The advantage, I think, is the quality of the words is so much greater. And I never wanted to print something that I wasn't proud of. And so that allowed me to print something that I was like, you know what, I did the best I could to tell this story the best I could. And I'm thankful that I had a fantastic group of women at Bloomsbury who are talented. They're just like us. They're readers, they're writers, they're dedicated to promoting material for students to read. And my one particular editor, Claire, just had such a keen eye on how to make Sophia's story, just to make it resonate with readers in a more, I don't know how to describe it. What she really did was take her story from like 99% to like 100%. She just transformed it by understanding Sophia and what Sophia might be. How do I describe it? She just transformed it in a way that I couldn't have done on my own. And I know that. I do not think I'm a great writer. I think I'm like I'm really good at imagining and creating, and I'm really hardworking, and I'm really bad at writing. So together I can like transform words to something reasonable. It just takes application. So I'm not good at all. I'm like good enough at a few things, and then I'm just really stubborn and determined. So that's kind of like the fortitude is what is required. And I might not be a great writer, but I had the fortitude to finish, and I trust that a publishing team, so for those that want to publish, at a major editorial house, they are incredibly talented. So.
And we appreciate that you persisted.
Thank you.
That you brought her story to us. I think that it's really interesting in the way that everything in your life led to this point in time, and you had an opportunity to tell the story you wanted to tell in the way you wanted to tell it. And hopefully you've created your own genre so that we can get more like this, because I think this is exactly the kind of empowering story that all our students need, in that, in spite of, big and small obstacles in our lives, we can prevail. That, like you can persist to the end. we're all keeping our fingers crossed that Sophia's story is not over.
It is not. I'm
But-
super excited about book 2.
But what I loved was that, there was this obstacle and this obstacle and this obstacle, and it didn't matter if it was avoiding the guy who wanted to date her or if it was avoiding the guy who wanted to kidnap her. Like, she was trying to figure it out, and she was doing so based on not only the need at the moment, but all that everything that she had learned, everything she had learned from her family, everything she had learned from experiences she was always going back to those things to solve her current situation.
I love that. You described that so well. I like to think we're all Sophia. We're all just trying to solve problems to the best we know how. So, thank you. That was so nice of you to say.
I have to ask, because there was a little hint towards this. So let's say it gets made into a movie.
Or a TV series.
Or a TV series. Perhaps we see it on some sort of screen.
Yeah,
Who would
I'm
be
sure
your
so.
dream cast?
Oh my gosh, I haven't even thought about this. So I am really
sure
excited.
there are fans out there who have thought
There
about
are
this.
fans. I get messages, and it's funny. First of all, I am really excited about what's moving on the film front, although I can't make any announcements. I don't know. I just think I think the girl that represents Sophia has to be incredibly clever and smart, because Sophia flips between languages and she's solving problems. And I don't know. I guess I don't have a dream. Let's see. When I was trying to think if I could think of someone off the top of my head.
Well, I think
I can't.
this sounds like a challenge for our readers and listeners, is to figure out who the dream cast is, because I'm sure that whoever in Hollywood is considering this needs our input.
They do, and they're going to be listening to this. I'll have to think of this and come back to you. This is a good question. I need to actually settle down on an answer. Sophia's not an abrasive character, and she's not aggressive, and she's not like this, like, I'm a combat veteran, like, mentality. She's not really in your face at all. She's far more delicate, I think, with the way she treats things. So I want someone that can counter that balance. I don't want Sophia to be this like boy spy figure, because that's not her. I feel like her assets are her femininity. Her assets are the delicate and insightful way she views things. It's not like she can rough and tumble all day long. That's not her skill set as an operator. It's it's her female qualities that make her strong.
And I love that that's how the book ends, is that's what comes into play when she solves the big problem that I didn't even know she had. And so when we got to the final scene, I was like, she is clever and she is smart. And in spite of all the training and the spy gadgets and everything else in her life, it was her brain that figured it out.
Oh, that's a compliment. That's what I wanted to do. So hopefully
I definitely love she kept playing the Sherlock. How her friends even pointed out, like, you're a freak. You're noticing things that, why are you noticing how I stand that I was a ballet dancer? Come on now. I loved those little details that you built up through the end, so that it wasn't unbelievable at the end that she would notice things and be able to figure things out. You gave every little step to get there.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Well, thank you again to both of you for joining us for our podcast.
Maybe we should leave the readers with the first line. Is that a good idea?
That's
The
a great
first
idea.
line. Tell the readers why the first line is important.
Okay, the first line's important. For my writers among you, first lines are important because for the reader, they want to ask a question, they want to read the next line. But for the writer, it's important to get the first line right, because it solves a major problem with writing, which is we tend to start the story too soon. And so writing an accurate first line is the best identifier I have found that we're starting the story in the right spot. Sorry, indicator, not identifier. I guess identifier is also right. The first line is the best indicator I found that I'm starting the story in the right spot. So I tend to start the story pretty late in the game. So here we are.
So listeners, I have the privilege of reading the first line from Girl from Nowhere by Tiffany Rosenhan, Chapter 1. Another knock at the door. I seal my grip tighter around the pistol. You have to get the book to see what happens next.
Did we succeed in the first line? I sure hope so. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for supporting our libraries and our students. I really believe that both of you are providing a safe place for our kids, and a place where they can find old friends that they can go back to throughout their life through the covers. You've been listening to Connect Canyons. If you have further story ideas, drop us a line.